I have a subscription account. They're my top supporters. They've been here since the beginning. They're the reason I get to sit here and get to interview you. And so one of the things that I give them the opportunity to do is ask each guest a question. This one is from Lester Dodson. How are you going to shut down the military-industrial complex and also keep the Chinese global steamroller from rolling up everything in its path?
I don't think China wants a military contest with us. Number one, we spend on our military more than the 10 next nations combined. We spend 3 times what China spends on its military. China wants to compete. China wants to dominate the world, but they want to do that on an economic playing field, not on a hot war with the U.S. military. I think the only reason that China would invade Taiwan is if we provoke them to do it. China has a lot of friends around the world now, and we've got a lot of enemies. James Baker, who was the Secretary of State, famously told Gorbachev, "We will not move NATO 1 inch to the east." And in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the first of the neocons, says, okay, here's a plan for moving NATO into every former Soviet territory. And people go crazy at that time. George Kennan, who is the most important diplomat in modern American history, who was the architect of the containment policy during the Cold War, he said, if you do that, you're going to turn Russia into an enemy. You should be treating it as a friend. If you do this, you're going to force Russia into a violent response. What do? We did it anyway. Why do we want to move NATO to the east? When a new country signs onto NATO, it has to then change all of its weapons purchases to NATO specifications, which means it has to buy all of its weapons from Lockheed, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman, and the U.S. military contractors that are all owned by BlackRock. So there's this economic imperative to drive NATO into all of these new countries. I was at school. I got picked up by my mom early. I saw men hauling the flags down to half-staff. I asked her why they were doing that. She hadn't spoken to me, and she said a bad man shot Uncle Jack. And then I got home. My father was walking at the bottom of the hill with John McComb when I got home, who was the CIA director, who was one of the first people to get to the house. My father said to him, "Did your people do this?" So his initial instinct was that the CIA had killed his brother. He made 2 other calls that day. One to the CIA desk officer in Langley, which again was less than a mile from my house, and he asked him the same question. And then he made the same call to Harry Ruiz, who is one of the leaders of the Cuban Brigade, and who was then staying in a hotel in Washington. And he asked him, did your people do this? He suspected it was the Cuban group that had done it. If you ask any questions about vaccines, particularly during COVID, you were marginalized and vilified. You were gaslighted. People who were injured and who publicly said they were injured were gaslighted. They were told, no, you weren't. You're lying. I've been going through this since 2005 when I published the transcriptions of a secret meeting that CDC had conducted in 2001 called Simpsonwood, when they realized that the vaccination program was linked to the epidemic of autism. And they had done an internal study of the largest medical database called the Vaccine Safety Data Link. Congress said to EPA, tell us what year this epidemic started. And EPA came back and said it's a red line, 1989. So you have allergic diseases, you have neurological diseases and autoimmune diseases, and obesity suddenly appear.
I've been seeing articles that say that you think that abortion should be up to full term.
My position on it evolved. What I learned in recent weeks was that a lot of those late-term abortions are, in fact, elective. And people make the decision for a variety of reasons. They break up a relationship or whatever. But it's sad, but it's true. And I don't think that should happen. I think the state does have a right to protect a child once they reach viability. It should be okay for the states to do that. That's where I changed my position. I think as a nation, a moral nation, we need to reduce the amount of abortions and increase the amount of live births and life. But I do think that ultimately we have to trust women. When I was a kid, nobody believed the government would lie to us. It was inconceivable the American government would tell a lie. The first time people understood that the government lied to us was in May of 1960, about 5 months before my uncle's election. A U-2 CIA spy plane got shut down over Russia. It accused the United States of operating this spy plane, and they said we shot it down. Alan Dulles told Eisenhower to lie about it. He said they don't have the pilot because the pilot's dead. They won't have enough parts from that plane to be able to prove anything. So Eisenhower got on TV and said it was all a lie by the Russians. And then the Russians produced Gary Francis Powers, and Americans for the first time went, oh my God, the U.S. government lied to us. We never thought that could happen. And then when my uncle was killed, 63, the Warren Commission report comes out, and half of Americans don't believe it. Oh, there again, people start thinking they're lying.
BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Argentina is now part of it.
Last time I checked, I think it was 22 countries are now part of it, and the whole premise is to destabilize.
It's to get off the American dollar, get off dependence, because what we've done is we've used the dollar as a military tool. We hold people's money because therefore Knox is the United States, our central banks. And so when they do something bad and we then shut off their cash, countries are just saying, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to use petrodollars anymore. We're going to shift to our own currencies, or we're going to create a global currency, and we're going to get off the American dollar to take the power away from America. And if that happens, the U.S. economy will go into a free fall. The question is, how fast is it going to happen? And are we going to be able to put safeguards in place to avoid a massive depression that could make the Great Depression look like a cakewalk? We have a $34 trillion debt right now. The service on that debt, the cost of servicing that debt is now bigger than our military budget. It's about $1 billion a year. Within 5 years, 50 cents out of every dollar that we collect in taxes is going to go to servicing the debt. We added another $1 trillion to the debt in the last 100 days. President Biden and President Trump are the guys who are most responsible for that. President Trump, during his 4 years, added $8 trillion to the debt. That's more money than was spent by every administration from George Washington to George W. Bush. And then he shut down all the businesses at the same time. And then Biden continued those policies, the lockdowns, and then, absurd spending, which is unsustainable. Military budget is about $890 billion. But if you include the costs of the wars, which is $300 billion in Veterans Administration, and then all the national security costs, it's about $1.3 trillion a year. And we have to cut that. And the main thing Putin wants is we agree never to put NATO into Ukraine. And they agreed to that. We signed that agreement, and Joe Biden sends Boris Johnson over from the UK, who's now the former prime minister, to tell Zelensky he's got to tear up the agreement because we wanted the war. And Zelensky tears it up. And, since then, there's probably been 600,000 Ukrainian kids who have died over there. Totally unnecessarily. My son went over there and fought with the Foreign Legion. He was a machine gunner in a special forces unit during the Kharkiv offensive. Connor and I argued every night at dinner about Ukraine. And when the war started, he had supported U.S. aid, and he felt like he shouldn't be one of these people who were advocating a war and then sitting on the sidelines and not willing to fight it. So he went over there and he joined the Foreign Legion. He worked for the first 3 or 4 weeks as a drone operator. The people that he was in the unit with are almost all gone. The CIA had at least 400 leading journalists in our country. They had an operation called Operation Mockingbird, which was an illegal operation to compromise American journalism. And they had some of the leading, in fact, Carl Bernstein in 1973 published a list of the 400 journalists who were secretly working for the CIA. And they were from all the leading papers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Newsweek. A lot of the editors, a lot of the publishers of those were, had signed security agreements with the CIA, and we're assets of the CIA. It was an illegal program. The CIA is allowed to propagandize around the world, and it's the biggest funder of journalism today in the world. It spends $10 billion a year through USAID to fund journalism all over the world. It owns some of the biggest newspapers and magazines, the most influential in the developing world, in Europe and around the world. There was an act called the Smith-Mundt Act that makes it illegal for the CIA to propagandize Americans. The term conspiracy theorists, there was a memo that went out to all of those journalists who were associated with the CIA in 1964, where they said that anybody who questions the Kennedy assassination, the Warren Report, which was the report that was done by a commission that was appointed by LBJ, and the commission was essentially told, and individual members were told, you got to say that this was a single gunman. Do not let people talk about a conspiracy theory. The named head of the commission was Earl Warren, who was the Supreme Court justice, but the real head of the commission was Allen Dulles, who had been the head of the CIA, who my uncle had fired. When my uncle died, he told a young journalist, he thought he was a god. I'm glad the little shit is dead. We now know that the CIA was directly involved in my uncle's assassination and in the, 60-year cover-up. They continue to be involved. They're still not releasing the last assassination documents that are required. I also think people shouldn't be forced to get a vaccine. And if you really think about it, most Americans don't think that either. For example, right now, CDC is recommending a 9th booster.
A 9th?
Ninth. Okay, so it's recommended that everybody get their 9th booster. There's fewer than 10% of Americans who are getting it. So 90% of Americans have lost faith in CDC. Do you think that we should do what the Biden administration did, which is to tell everybody, if you don't get that 9th booster, you can't work. You should be publicly shamed. You shouldn't be able to fly on an airplane. You shouldn't be able to walk into a public building. Your rights should be curtailed. Does anybody think that we should be doing that? I don't think most Americans believe that people should be compelled to get a 9th vaccine, and which means that they don't trust CDC anymore.
So you're tough on Second Amendment. What is your stance when it comes to gun control?
What I've said about the Second Amendment is I'm not going to take anybody's guns. I spent a lot of my life in rural areas in this country where gun culture is part of people's identities. I understand also we've been through 3 years during COVID when the U.S. Constitution was under attack, that we already got rid of the First Amendment. We closed all the churches for a year. We now have censored speech. We got rid of the right to assembly with social distancing. We closed 3.3 million businesses, no due process, no just compensation, violation of the Fifth Amendment. We got rid of the Fourth Amendment's prohibitions against warrantless searches and seizures with all the track and trace surveillance. I think we've seen this wholesale assault on the Constitution, and the last thing that we need to see is now an assault on the Second Amendment. There's a lot of Americans who believe that the only reason the Second Amendment hasn't come under assault is because of the Second Amendment.